Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga and LaRouche. It's March 11th, 2020, and now we're very deep into a process which has been unfolding rapidly with the coronavirus, the emergence of a pandemic worldwide. And Helga, this is something that people in the West have been trying to wish away, but it's something that's not going to be wished away. It requires a total change in thinking. Why don't you start with your thoughts on that? Because you have been very out front in the need for an emergency call to reject this old paradigm and move to the new.
Yes, I think that the situation is very serious. It probably will not be possible without a lot of casualties, but nevertheless, if there are decisive measures now and a complete change in the attitude, uh, the damage can be minimalized. Otherwise, it will be catastrophic. Now, I think it is useful to listen to the experts from Germany who are making regular podcasts. Christian Drosten, the virologist from the Charité, and Dr. Kieler, Professor Kieler from the Robert Koch Institute, and they put out very drastic warnings. What Drosten said is that there will be no lessening of the increase in the spring and summer period, which some people temporarily assumed, because we will face a virus wave, and naturally, in the in the summer period, the virus will continue to spread to the southern hemisphere, where there will be winter, and then, in all likelihood, return uh, even more and with possible mutations in the fall. And a vaccine, as of now, cannot be expected before a year or so. So Merkel announced what is now commonplace among many leaders of countries, that the infection rate probably will infect 70% of the population. And unfortunately, it is absolutely not true what our health minister Spahn still thought in January, which is really incredible, where he said that the coronavirus does not represent a danger for Germany, and that the infection rate or the mortality rate of the coronavirus would be lower than of the common flu. That's what he said in January. Now, obviously, that was not the case was clear already if people looked to China, which in the month of January was waging an incredible battle. And by closing down the entire city of Wuhan and Hubei province, affecting a lockdown for 60 million people, implementing it and also enforcing it, and having a population which was very cooperative in doing so. According to the World Health Organization, China has set a new standard in dealing with such pandemics. And, the West could have taken that as an example, but people in the West are just too arrogant, too Eurocentristic or Western centristic. So they thought they can ignore it, or even think, this is affecting China and not coming to Europe or the United States. So they lost 3 valuable months. Maybe not entirely, but obviously a completely different attitude would have been necessary. And now it is spreading and changing by the hour. So people are completely aware of the fact that this is out of control. And I do not want to, add to any panic, but it is very clear that the numbers which are announced right now are not accurate. I talked to my colleagues in France today, and there are only a little bit more than 1,000 tests which have been made in France so far. I mean, that is not a representative figure which comes out then. And we have some cases where people clearly have symptoms and they try to get tests, and they were told there are no tests in France right now. France doesn't have the production capability, and all the tests have been bought up, and there simply are no tests. So, obviously, the fact that in Germany there are only 2 deaths so far as of this webcast, um, they attribute that to the very well testing. Now, we have to see. I think that the lesson from Wuhan, and now that Italy, all of Italy is basically a red zone after some, very irrational behavior on the side of some citizens after the north was locked down, you have a quite advanced situation. But I think the lesson to be learned from all of that is that we have to learn from China. We have to get rid of our Western arrogance and simply look at the way how China effectively dealt with it. And then the only conclusion is that you have to enforce these measures before you have a mass of cases. That means that if you have anywhere a region, like some cities and some areas in North Rhine-Westphalia, one should apply the Wuhan model immediately. It should be closed down. There should be quarantine for a certain number of weeks. And these measures must be taken early on, because everything which counts in this is the speed to take preemptive measures before the virus spreads completely out of control. So I think we are in a very serious situation, but it's not, it's not some moment where you can completely panic, but there are clear ways, and I think the Chinese efficiency with which they dealt with this should be a lesson for everybody.
When you speak of the arrogance, I think you're referring to in particular the continued adherence to geopolitics, to the neoliberal model, the whole idea that the West is superior, the West has solved all the problems. I mean, isn't this what hampers the thinking of people at the European Union and many of the people in the US Congress and think tanks in the United States?
I think the reaction so far by the leading politicians, for example, the European finance ministers, the so-called Eurogroup, they have a meeting on the 16th of March, and on their agenda is first the European Stability Mechanism, and then something else, and then only third the coronavirus effect. And it is very clear that the reason why the reaction was so late and why they didn't use the word pandemic, because they were more concerned about the stock market, the efficiency and profits coming from the so-called pandemic bond, which is an absurdity all by itself, that you would try to finance the cost of pandemics with bonds, which people can make profit of, but only if you have the maturity of the bond. So I think the thinking is still very, very much dominated by the geopolitical idea. I mean, for example, yesterday I was listening, one should actually stop doing that. I was listening to the ZDF news, and this moderator, uh, blasted, instead of reporting, they reported about the corona crisis, but then instead of praising what the Chinese accomplished in Wuhan, he took the occasion to blast China and attack it. And that kind of an attitude, or to continue to attack Russia, China, that has to stop. Because if you look at it, the only way how humanity will get out of it is international cooperation. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, has just telephoned with the Italian foreign minister Di Maio, and the Chinese offered to share their experience, to send experts. They are donating masks, protective suits, and tests to Italy. This is a completely different approach, and I think the West has much to learn how to respond to challenges which are all of humanity is facing. And this whole geopolitical thinking really is one of troglodytes and should be eliminated completely.
We see people like Pompeo continuing to attack China. He calls it the Wuhan virus. You have this kind of attitude when in fact, what we're seeing is a significant drop of cases in China. And there, you mentioned earlier the importance of Xi Jinping going to Wuhan to talk to the people who are at the front lines. I think it's important to report this, Helga, because it's not going out in the Western press.
Well, I think that I have proposed something which, may look impossible to some people, but I dare the prediction that the situation will, because of this ineffectiveness of Western response, that the situation will come soon to the point where more and more people are recognizing that what I'm saying is the only way to address this problem. So what I have reiterated is this call to have a summit, an emergency summit by Xi Jinping, Putin, Trump, Modi, as a minimum combination to address all these problems, because it's very clear that we need an international cooperation concerning the corona pandemic. This is already threatening the international financial system. We saw in the last several weeks several plunges, absolutely of the same dimension like it was after the 2008 systemic collapse or after the September 11 attack. And only because the central banks have now decided to flood the markets, to lower the interest rates, like the Bank of England lowered the interest rates by 0.5%, 50 base points today, as if the simple pushing of liquidity would remedy any of the real physical causes why the system is collapsing. So I want to have a mobilization of the population to demand that the leaders of the most important governments of the United States, Russia, China, and India meet to discuss the 4 points which were proposed by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, several years ago, because you need to have the immediate end of the global casino economy by implementing a Glass-Steagall system. We have discussed this many times on this program, but it is the only combination of measures which would address the problem. Then you need a national bank in every country. In Germany, we could extend the functions of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, have a national bank in every other country, have an international cooperation among these national banks, reinstate fixed exchange rates, and then have agreements about industrial development projects like the industrial development of Southwest Asia, of Africa, and this will become then a new Bretton Woods system. There must be a cooperation with the Chinese new Silk Road to have these kinds of development plans, and we need a crash program to go into a new platform of higher productivity of the economy, joint cooperation in advanced technologies like fusion, like biophysics, like space cooperation, and then basically such a summit could implement these measures and could then have a series of such summits, and that way change the geopolitics and move towards an international cooperation, a shared future of humanity. And that shift has to occur. And I'm predicting, and I think I'm on the safe side in doing so, that the crisis will accelerate. There will be many more unfortunate consequences, and people will recognize that to establish a completely different level of thinking will be the only way out for all of mankind. So if you agree with that, you should help this mobilization. There is a resolution which is attached to this webcast. Please sign it. Please spread it among your friends and colleagues. Get more people to sign it, because we need a public discussion about this and a public demand that the whole world moves into a completely new way of cooperating and solving these kinds of problems.
I've received a few emails from people who have asked, why do we focus on neoliberalism as the problem? What does that have to do with the virus? And I think it's important to look at what Dr. Redfield of the CDC had to say about the need to rebuild the system, that the so-called just-in-time system, which has been accepted as an economic model, doesn't work. You need redundancy. And Helga, I think it'd be very useful for you to just review again why this neoliberal system is the cause or sets humanity up for these kinds of crises. Because this is what your husband was warning going back to 1971, the Biological Holocaust Task Force he set up, and so on.
Well, I think that the prognosis of Lyndon LaRouche, which he made on the 15th of August 71, when Nixon dissolved the Bretton Woods system by going to floating exchange rates, by decoupling the dollar from the gold standard, and that way opening the deregulation of the markets, which has escalated ever since. My husband at that point had made the prognosis that if the West would continue on this road of liberalizing the markets, of going with neoliberal monetarist policies, that it would end up in a new depression and the danger of a new fascism, or one would go to a completely new economic system. Now, that prognosis has proven to be absolutely on the mark. And the biological ecological Holocaust task force, which you just mentioned, he set up in 74, and it was to study the effects of the policies of the IMF and the World Bank on the economic system, especially in the developing sector. And in the meantime, we have produced many studies, which you can all see in our archives, that if you impose such austerity or zero growth policies, especially on the developing countries, that you would inevitably cause the emergence of old diseases and new diseases, because you cannot consistently lower the living standard of entire continents, as the IMF and the World Bank have done in the last 50 years, without creating conditions of breakdown. And that is exactly what you see right now, because you don't have only the coronavirus crisis, you have the locust situation getting completely out of control in many African states, in the Horn of Africa, but spreading now into some Arabic countries, into Pakistan, India, even threatening to go into China. Then naturally, as part of this geopolitical liberal scheme of the West, the refugee crisis, it's not a natural phenomena. It is the result of the interventionist wars conducted by the Bush administrations and Obama. The idea that you have to spread democracy and human rights, and that it's legitimate to make interventionist wars against Iraq. Doesn't matter if it's based on lies, that there were so-called weapons of mass destruction, which Nancy Pelosi in the meantime admitted they all knew it was a lie and they did it anyway. Iraq, Afghanistan, these are all the reasons why you have a refugee crisis. The underdevelopment of Africa is the result of these policies. So that is why I'm saying that if you don't get rid of this paradigm, which has many elements, it has geopolitics, it has neoliberal economic policies, but it also has a Malthusian dimension to it. The green axiom, which says that nature or some spiders or some ants somewhere are more important than human beings. And I even go so far to say that I think that the reason why there is such a absolutely bestial attitude, I mean, on the coronavirus, do you think that most African countries or Asian, Latin American countries who do not have the health systems we have, do you think they are testing their people? I don't think so. So the figures are in all likelihood completely way off. And the ability of these countries to remedy it is much, much less. And I'm absolutely convinced that there are some people who say, oh, there are too many people anyway. So like Bertrand Russell, he said you need a pandemic every generation. I mean, these are quotes we have published many times. And the absolutely disgusting way how the EU is dealing with the refugee crisis, now again erupting at the Turkish-Greek border. I mean, that is a mindset which is disgusting. And it is the reflection of geopolitics, of the Malthusian idea that there are too many people anyway. Now, Erdogan obviously is playing his own terrible games, but I think in this moment where innocent people who have nothing, I mean the whole thing is that these refugees, even if they are sitting in camps for some years and start speaking Turkish, and now Erdogan is instrumentalizing them, that may all be true. That's what the Greeks are saying, but it means what is the solution to that? You have to stop insisting that you have regime change in Syria. That has to stop. There has to be a recognition that the only legitimate government in Syria is the one which the Syrian people themselves elect. There was a constitutional process underway, which is now stopped again. That has to be resumed. There has to be an end to the war. Turkey should not be backed by NATO. This is an insane idea. The US Special Envoy Jeffries just demanded that NATO should fully back up Turkey against Syria. That is complete insanity. What needs to be done is you have to have peace with Syria, and then you have to have an orderly negotiation between the Assad government and the opposition to arrange for the return of the Syrians in their own country, which is what most people want to do anyway. So I think that all of these assumptions that you just keep going with the policies which have proven to be a failure, that has to absolutely stop. So I don't see a sign that the European establishment is capable of doing it. That just means we need a mobilization of the population, because this is getting a serious existential crisis for all of us. And we have to take responsibility to put in a new paradigm, a paradigm of cooperation, and then we can solve most problems. At least over time, we can find solutions to such problems like Corona. But we need to change the view on the West towards China and Russia, and this whole idea that the regime change are allowed under the pretext of spreading democracy and human rights is one of these imperial colonialist ideas which have to go.
Another perfect example of that is the extension of sanctions, the expansion of sanctions against Iran and Venezuela for regime change in the face of this growing pandemic. I'd like to come back to one other point, which I think you alluded to earlier, which is the financial crisis. We now see if something's going to be quarantined, we ought to quarantine Wall Street and the Bank of England. The idea that lower interest rates will solve something, but what's going on with the repo lending, the incredible demand for liquidity without any concern of solvency. This is the other aspect of Mr. LaRouche's warnings over many years.
Yes, well, I don't know how long this will continue, and I think what the central banks are proposing is completely irresponsible, because the continuous flooding of the markets with money and the idea to go even to negative interest rate, I mean, all of this is already eating up the savings and the life earnings of the population, and is threatening at some point to go into a hyperinflation. So these derivatives must be absolutely written off. This is why Glass-Steagall is so absolutely crucial. And I think the whole EU program, as it was announced by von der Leyen in the presence of this deplorable Greta Thunberg, that has to go too, because you cannot have an industrial state and implement these policies. I think if you want to have hospitals, if you want to have enough, you know, intensive care units to deal with such a situation, you have to have a productive society. And that green policy of von der Leyen, it has to go. And we need the full package I talked about before, Glass-Steagall and a return to Hamiltonian banking, which, you know, every time there was a successful economic history in, let it be the, the New Deal of Roosevelt, let it be the reconstruction of Germany in the post-war period, these were the principles which were applied, and that is what is urgently required.
And while all this is going on, we have this incredible soap opera in US politics around the Democratic nomination. I think it'd be very useful as we come toward an end of this webcast for you to emphasize again what you think people should do to make sure we can change the paradigm. There's a hunger for change. People are still extremely unhappy and now very nervous, both because of the financial crisis and the coronavirus. What should people do? How should they respond?
Well, since you mentioned the US situation, I think it's a big problem because unfortunately Trump said he had a hunch that the mortality rates of the coronavirus were much less than what the World Health Organization was saying. Now, I think that he's probably saying that because of the election campaign and he thinks that this will intervene. But, you know, I think the reality will assert itself very quickly. This will come as fast as it came, you know, in Europe, maybe faster even. And, you know, the US right now is really unprepared. I mean, the health system was taken down even more than in Europe. Um, the Democrats have this Biden now as a major candidate. I can only advise people there is a very interesting collection of videos which was published by Consortium News. I think the author is Kathleen Johnson, and she collected about 20 or so videos of speeches of Biden, where you clearly can see that he doesn't have it anymore. He lost it. So the idea to somebody who has clear signs of aging, to put it mildly, to think that you can run him through the Democratic convention, the election campaign, and then win the election in November against Trump is also a sign of extreme mental deterioration of the people who think they can do that and get away with it. So, you know, if you look at all of these things, we need a completely new thinking. We are in a dark age. The dark age is absolutely comparable to the 14th century when the Black Death killed 1/3 of the European population and people just went crazy. You see signs of this insanity already now, and we need therefore a completely different approach, like it came with the 15th century and the Golden Renaissance in Italy. You know, we can talk about that some next time, but I think people have to really recognize we are in a dark age and we have to reject all the assumptions which have led to this present situation. And I actually would like to make one other point. I think the coronavirus will force lockdowns. It will force measures. You know, schools and universities are already closed for several weeks in several countries. You don't know yet what will be the effect of all of this on the financial system, on the real economy. And I think under these circumstances, you know, where Merkel is talking about that 70% of the population will get infected. And, you know, if you assume that worldwide it may be 100 million people, and then if you take present mortality rates, it will be 2 to 4 million people. Under these circumstances, we should not have war games. And therefore, I think we need to stop the present NATO maneuver in Eastern Europe, the European Defender 2020, because obviously, you know, the virus does not stop in front of the military. And to have these kinds of things going on when you have an immediate health threat to the population is really something which doesn't make any sense. So this NATO maneuver should stop. Presently, the, I think, highest commander of the US forces in Germany is a victim of the coronavirus and is quarantined in Wiesbaden. So, that should just give people to think that the virus does not stop in front of the military. And I think we should go in the direction of mobilizing for this summit. I know people think that this is too big, but sometimes, when you are in a real crisis, only if you reach a completely new level of thinking, namely the idea that all the major countries of the world, the United States, Russia, China, and India as a minimum, and then other countries can come together with these countries, only if you change the level of thinking and the level of approach that you can find a solution. So if you agree with that, then help us in this mobilization, because I don't think, we will do other things. We will call for the rebuilding of the health sector. There are other things we can do, but I think that because of the complexity of the world situation, the interaction of all of the elements of the breakdown, that we will not solve the problem unless we go to a completely new paradigm, a new system of international relations. And you should help us in this mobilization. And that's the very best thing you can do for your own life and your own future.
And I would recommend toward that end that people circulate this webcast, get this webcast around so people can hear the extent of the crisis and the solutions. And secondly, go to our website and download the call for the emergency summit from Helga LaRouche. Take that to your city council, to your trade union group, to your, maybe you shouldn't go too far, but you can certainly use the internet to get it around and get people signing and supporting it. So Helga, anything else you want to add?
No, I think this is a moment where, people will, be freaked out, and it's understandable. But sometimes a shock is also a healthy one if it helps you to get out of a wrong idea and to think things through and then move ahead and find a solution. So I would urge people to, overcome your present feelings and be confident that if we work together as one humanity, we can solve this.
Okay, well, with that, we'll see you again next week.
Till next week.